All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, my name is Jen Snook. I'm a Senior Manager for the Decarbonizing Industrial Supply Chain Energy Initiative at the Clean Energy Buyers Institute. Today, we are happy to host a Sectoral Pathways to Decarbonize Aluminum webinar, and are joined today with two fantastic panelists. If you will, Marlena, next slide. So we have Pernell Nunez, who is the Deputy Director General and Director of Sustainability at the Aluminium Institute. Pernell has over 10 years of experience in the metals and mining industry. She began her career as a consultant at CRU, where she worked on a range of market strategy projects across base metals, aluminum, and iron ore. Pernell joined the International Aluminium Institute in 2015, and which is one of the leading, if not actually the leading, global association for the aluminum industry, with members involved with bauxite mining, alumina, and aluminum production across all major producing regions. At the IAI, Pernell is responsible for the Institute's broad sustainability work program and has worked on a range of collaborative industry projects, including life cycle impact assessment, sustainable waste management, and GHG emissions accounting and pathways. Pernell holds a Master's of Science in Geology from the Royal School of Mines, Imperial College London. After we hear from Pernell, we'll hear from RENEE van Hoosten. RENEE is the project lead materials at the World Economic Forum, with a particular focus on steel and aluminium, and is seconded to the Mission Possible Partnership, a broad collaboration between the World Economic Forum, RMI, and the Energy Transitions Commission, and we mean Business Coalition. RENEE leads the Aluminium for Climate Initiative in collaboration with the Energy Transitions Commission. So with that, I will pass it off to Pernell. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks very much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be with you today to tell you a little bit more about us as the IAI and some of the work that we've been doing, particularly on the sector pathways for greenhouse gas emissions out to 2050. So next slide, please. A little introduction to us as an organisation. So we are the global association, as Jen mentioned, for the aluminium industry. Our members are mostly involved in bauxite mining, alumina production and aluminium production, as well as some recycling as well. We have data very much at the heart of a lot of the work that we do, and we have over 40 years of experience in collecting data directly from industry. We are a member-based organisation. We have 25 member companies and they are engaged across all the major producing regions. And we have a pretty small team. So our secretariat is made of only 10 people. Most of us are based in the UK, but many of us have actually been with the organisation for a number of years now. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to start off with a little bit of context. So understanding aluminium's role in society and the role it plays in lots of different end use sectors, how that might impact demand going forward for aluminium. Then I'm going to look at, I guess, the kind of the core topic, which is around greenhouse gas emissions and some potential scenarios out to 2050. And then finally, I'm going to conclude looking at those specific pathways that we've identified towards decarbonisation. Next slide, please. So starting off with that context setting, aluminium has got a whole host of different properties that make it quite desirable across a variety of different end-use markets. It's a very widely used material. Building and construction and transportation are probably two of the largest end-use sectors. Each of those account for about a quarter of total demand. And then we have other key end-use sectors, things like packaging, machinery and equipment, and electrical uses as well. They're all sort of key segments for us as a material. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour of the kind of host of different end uses that the material goes into. And it really is quite a diverse selection. Next slide, please. Now, coming to some of those properties, it has made, I think, a lot of headlines in recent years because of its lightweight nature. So in the automotive sector, for example, its very high strength to weight ratio has been used by some of the automakers because it means that we're able to make cars and structures that are particularly light and stable and also fuel efficient. So with increasing kind of fuel efficiency standards, that's brought real benefits for the automotive sector. It's also very durable and formable, again, properties that are probably very valued in things like construction. It means we're able to have long-lived buildings that are well designed and flexible for lots of different needs. And then I guess touching on kind of recyclability and packaging, you know, its protective nature means that it creates a barrier. So it's ideal for things like food packaging, medicine packaging, and of course that means we can also reduce waste, which in turn has other knock-on benefits in terms of kind of environmental impact as well. Now, touching on recycling, there's a kind of often quoted phrase in our industry that recycling actually saves about 95% of the energy that's required when you compare it to primary aluminium production. And so I'll talk a little bit today about how important recycling is going to be for us as a sector going forward in terms of its impact on our greenhouse gas emissions and also on other kind of environmental impacts that go along with our process too. So next slide, please. Now, aluminium has been fairly widely recognised by a number of different organisations as being quite a key metal, not only for society and technology today, but it's going to be key in terms of the transition to low carbon energy systems in the future. So it's used fairly widely in things like renewables energy technology, so in photovoltaic cells, in wind, in carbon capture utilisation and storage, in other energy storage, and it also has a key role to play in things like electric vehicles. As I mentioned, it's quite a key property is its ability to make things lighter. And so with the increased use of heavy batteries in vehicles, we're looking towards lighter materials to make those cars feasible for the future. So there really is a role for metals such as aluminium and many others to play in some of this transition over the next 10 to 20 years. Next slide, please. And so because of that growth and because of that demand for things like the energy transition and increasing electrification, we at the IAI expect demand for aluminium to actually increase quite significantly out to 2050. And so here we see our demand projections out to 2050 for semi-fabricated goods. And so we expect demand to grow from about 95 million tonnes in 2018 up to almost 170 million tonnes by 2050. And there are a whole host of sectors that are going to drive that growth. So we're looking at transport up by 90%, building and construction 80%, electrical uses, packaging and consumer durables, all of them with relatively strong growth out to 2050. Next slide, please. Now, whenever we talk about aluminium and metal, probably more broadly, people always ask me the question, well, can we not just recycle more? You know, recycling is kind of the answer. We need to recycle more. And we absolutely acknowledge that we should be recycling as much as possible. But because of that growing demand, we actually don't have enough metal available to recycle and continue to fulfill that demand. So what we have is aluminium actually in very long-lived products. So it's still in the buildings and it's still in the cars, and so it's not actually available for us to recycle and make use of again. And so that's why we actually say that demand growth can't actually be fulfilled by recycling alone. We had about 1.5 billion tonnes of metal that's been produced since 1888, and actually 1.1 billion tonnes is still in use today. So it's still actually in products. It's still being used in various different forms. And so that means we are limited, you know, the scrap pool is actually a limited resource. We must continue to recycle as much as we can, but also acknowledge that we can't necessarily meet all of our needs purely through recycled metal. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to kind of shift the focus a little bit to the sort of the core part of my presentation, and that's looking more closely at greenhouse gas emissions and some of the impacts associated with the primary aluminium production process. I'm going to take a look at 3 different areas. So the first is our baseline scenario. So that is, what do we emit today? What does making aluminium mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions today? Then I'm going to look at a business as usual scenario. So that takes the demand expectations we have for the next 30 years and looks at what if nothing hugely changes from the way that we operate as an industry today. And then the last part of it is going to look at the decarbonisation scenarios. That's looking at what do we have to do as a sector in order to align with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so those are some interesting decarbonisation scenarios aligned with some of the work that's been done with the International Energy Agency. So next slide, please. So starting off with that baseline, we took 2018 as our baseline year. And that showed us that actually the sector as a whole emitted approximately 1.1 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2018. Now this chart here shows you a full breakdown of that 1.1 billion tonnes, and it breaks it down by the types of emission. So whether it's come from your electricity source or your transportation or your thermal energy. So that's all down the left-hand side there. And then across the top, we have the various different production processes. So whether it's actually mining the ore from the ground or it's producing the metal at a smelter in terms of electrolysis. And so that shows you really, it's a heat chart. It shows you which are the biggest contributors to our emissions, which are more moderate contributors in yellow, and then which contribute the least in green. And you can kind of see screaming out at you there, the red is associated with those electricity related emissions. So 670 million tonnes associated with electricity, and 824 million tonnes of CO2 of that 1.1 billion that are electrolysis related emissions. So it is a significant portion of our sector emissions. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now here I'm going to look at those decarbonisation scenarios along with our business as usual, usual scenario. So the red line along the top is our business as usual scenario, and that shows us that our sector emissions could grow from that 1.1 billion tonnes that I just mentioned in 2018 up to potentially as much as 1.6 billion tonnes if we don't change anything in our process. We don't change the way the industry operates, we don't change our power sources, all those types of things, but we do add capacity in order to meet that growth in demand. So we do have new capacity coming on, and that means that emissions could go from 1.1 billion tonnes up to 1.6. Now I think it's pretty widely recognised that growing your emissions is not aligned with society's goals and the goals indeed of the Paris Agreement. And so what we've done is we've actually used the International Energy's data as a framework for us to understand what it would mean to be Paris aligned. And so the other 2 scenarios here on this chart show you what it means under a beyond 2 degrees scenario, which is in green, which is in orange, and then a 1.5 degree scenario, which is in green. So those 2 scenarios take that International Energy Agency's economy-wide analysis and translates it to what it would mean for us as a sector. And so that shows you we would require some really significant emissions reductions under those 2 scenarios. So for our beyond 2 degrees, it would be that 1.1 billion tonnes coming down to just 250 million tonnes overall. And then for that 1.5 degrees, which is the most ambitious, it comes down from 1.1 billion tonnes to just about 50 million tonnes by 2050. So real sort of step change, radical change for the industry if we're going to be aligned with those Paris Agreement goals. Under both of these scenarios, out to 2050, we're seeing electricity related emissions, so that biggest portion, that red portion on our heat charts, actually come down to close to 0. So that's a fundamental shift from the way that we currently operate to a near zero electricity emissions point by 2050. Next slide, please. So now I'm just converting those sector trajectories into what it means on a per tonne basis. So for every single tonne of aluminium that's produced, what are the emissions that are associated with it? So today, the global average is about 16.1 for primary metal. So for every tonne of primary metal, we emit about 16.1 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere, and that is a significant number. In order to be aligned with those trajectories, that number would have to come down from 16.1 to 2.5 under a beyond 2 degrees scenario, and down to 0.5 under a 1.5 degree scenario. So again, just mirroring that significant step change for the sector. There's a similar story for recycled metal. So it's not only the primary industry that has to do something about its emissions, the recycled metal part has to do its fair share too. So today it's about 0.6 tonnes of CO2 emissions per tonne of recycled metal. By 2050, we're looking at 0.2 under beyond 2 degrees and 0.1 under that 1.5 degree trajectory. So there is actually something for every single person across our value chain to do. There isn't anyone really that's operating currently at the level that's required in order for us to be aligned with those goals of the Paris Agreement. That's really just kind of highlighting the significant amount of work that needs to happen between now and 2050 for the sector. Next slide, please. And so we've really kind of turning to technology and understanding the critical role that it's going to have to play for us as a sector over the next couple of decades. Through our greenhouse gas pathways working group, we've identified 3 sort of key pathways for us. Now, the first one focuses on our biggest contributors, and that's the electricity portion, as I've mentioned a number of times. And decarbonising that would really go a long way to actually helping the entire sector move down that emissions trajectory. And so we've identified there that if we can incorporate greater amounts of zero carbon electricity into the production process, potentially install increasing amounts of carbon capture, utilisation and storage technology, and also improve our energy efficiency as much as possible, we can really bring down some of those sector emissions. Our second pathway focuses on what we call our direct emissions. So those are the emissions that come directly from chemical reactions within our process, or that come from the combustion of thermal energy to produce heat within our processes. And here we've got a few different ways that we can sort of tackle these emissions. So again, we look to carbon capture, utilisation and storage for some aspects. We look towards technological step change, so things such as inert anodes. These are replacing materials that are currently in our process and emit CO2 directly, and that means that could potentially take some of our process emissions out. And the final one really is about electrification, so electrifying whatever we possibly can across our processes, whether that be furnaces within the cast house or the refinery, looking towards fuel switching, the potential of incorporating things like green hydrogen into some of our thermal processes, looking at things like that to bring down all of those direct emissions as much as possible. And then our third and final pathway focuses on recycling and resource efficiency. So I've mentioned that recycling is an important part of our mix, and it's going to probably be increasingly important out to 2050. And so what we need to do is increase that recycling rate across all those different end uses as close as possible to 100%. Now, we have lots of sectors that do very well at recycling, and we have some that have room for improvement. So I think that's definitely an area that we can sort of almost act on immediately, because that's about, you know, improving recycling rates as much as possible. We need to find ways to reduce the amount of scrap that's being generated in some of the manufacturing processes. So when you produce a car door from a sheet of aluminium, you always have a little bit of wastage. So reducing some of that wastage means that we can reduce the need for primary metal. And then finally, eliminating any metal losses. So whenever you melt some of the recycled material and make new products, you always have a little bit of losses. So finding some new technologies to minimize those as much as possible, again, reduces the need for primary metal, and then of course brings with it greenhouse gas emission savings. So a mixture of all those three pathways really could help to bring sector emissions in line with those Paris trajectories. Next slide, please. Now, the kind of, I guess, the scale of the challenge ahead isn't lost on me. It is a significant challenge for the sector, and we're going to have to see a lot more investment in terms of technology over the coming years. I think deployment is going to be one of the most challenging things, because if you look at those three pathways, we actually already have a lot of that technology in place in many parts of the world, but it's actually the deployment across the sector that's going to be one of the harder things to achieve, I think. We've started to see some deployment now into commercial scale. So here's just a little map that kind of illustrates some of the examples all the way across the world that are aligned with those three pathways that I mentioned. So whether it be increasing renewables in Europe and the Middle East, or some of that direct emissions reductions opportunities such as hydrogen being explored in Norway or Australia, or new recycling facilities or new recycling techniques being explored in various parts of the world. There are actually things happening now, which is quite promising, because we do need to increase that rate of change as we look towards 2030. Next slide, please. So there are a few key things that we think will help to sort of accelerate action across the aluminium sector over the next decade. Firstly, policy obviously plays quite a critical role. We need to make sure that we have frameworks that are in place that actually allow a whole range of different solutions. One thing that we completely recognise is that each site and each operator has very specific circumstances that they're operating under, and so sometimes not every solution is going to suit the circumstance, and so we need to make sure that we actually have policy that allows lots of different technologies to proliferate and to be deployed across different regions. We need to look to investment. You know, a lot of this requires some significant amount of capital. We're talking about big capital expenditure, big technology projects, and there's no way that we can do it alone as an industry. We look towards increasing transparency and disclosure. So speaking the same language, talking about the same kind of metrics, making sure we're actually being able to track progress over time. I think that's going to play a critical role for us, and making sure that helps people to make informed decisions. We see an increasing role for things like public-private partnerships in order to get some of these projects off the ground. If you're able to kind of bring together that technology from the private sector with the resources and expertise of the public sector, I think it's a good way to deliver some of these large-scale projects. We've increasingly seen more and more customer-producer relationships. So a lot of strategic partnerships between people in the aluminium value chain and people further downstream or upstream. So I think we're likely to see more and more of that, because they are mutually beneficial. We see increasing kind of scrutiny around, you know, entire supply chains rather than just, you know, single operations. People are interested in the full provenance of their goods and services. And of course, at the heart of all of this really is kind of collaboration. So a lot of this can't happen in isolation. We're having to work across the whole value chain, across a whole selection of different actors. And so that's going to continue to be a really important point, I think, for us going forward as a sector. Next slide, please. So just to kind of bring it all to a close, I wanted to conclude to sort of say that it's clear that aluminium does have a role to play in a sustainable future. And because of that, we think that aluminium products demand will continue to increase. We're going to have to see action from across the whole value chain in order to reduce some of those emissions, and that collaboration, innovation and investment is really going to be critical to deploying some of the technology that's needed across our sector and many other hard to abate sectors as well. So that's hopefully a whirlwind tour through some of the work that we've been doing at the IAI, and I'm very happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Pernell. And just as a reminder for everyone, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions as they come up, please drop them in the Q&A box in the Zoom window. I see one in there already. So now I'll pass it off to RENEE.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you so much for hosting this. My name is RENEE. I work at the forum, as was mentioned, with the Mission Possible Partnership. And we'll take literally a whistle-stop tour around what we are doing. So Pernell really gave you the context of what some of the pathways and enablers are for the aluminium sector. The Mission Possible Partnership is all about how do we translate this context into actual action and deliverables. Next slide, please. So first, maybe about the Mission Possible Partnership as a collective. The Mission Possible Partnership was established early 2021 among several partners to really bring together leading voices on decarbonization, climate finance, and policy development, and really to focus on transformational change in the coming decade on the most carbon-intensive industries across the globe. We work particularly with 7 harder-to-abate sectors, to which I will return, and it is looking at what does zero carbon pathway look like for each one of the sector, but also what are some of the enabling factors across these sectors to accelerate this transition. Next slide, please. Very briefly about the Mission Possible Partnership as a collective. The Mission Possible Partnership is really a global partnership agreement among several actors. It was founded by 4 core partners that you can see on this slide. These are the Energy Transitions Commission, Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, that is probably very well known to you, the Women Business Coalition, and the World Economic Forum. But we are supported by an ecosystem of many, many different stakeholders. A lot of them you can see on this slide, but we are also working with partners for each sector specifically to deliver our work, of which the IAI is one of our fundamental partners in our work on aluminium. Next slide, please. So I already mentioned that we are looking at what we call harder to abate sectors, and it's really 7 industries across heavy industries and heavy duty transport. What you can see here are the sectoral initiatives that are hosted under the umbrella of the Mission Possible Partnership that are around shipping, which is known as the Getting to Zero Coalition, aviation, heavy duty transport, aluminium, of course, what we are about today, but also materials such as concrete, chemicals, and iron and steel. Next slide, please. Next slide. Very brief about the Aluminium for Climate, which is one of the 7 sector-specific initiatives. So it's really established already actually before the official launch of Mission Possible Partnership in early 2020 to really substantially drive to reduce industry emissions by several ways. And these are very familiar based on Pernell's presentation that we just had, which are the fundamental pathways to decarbonize the sector. One is focused on decarbonizing electricity consumption in the aluminium manufacturing. Secondly, it's really looking at the process emissions, the direct emissions coming from aluminium manufacturing. And thirdly, it's the role of recycling. How can recycling not only ensure there is, to a certain extent, reduced demand for primary aluminium, because it will result in a 95% drop of energy needs, but also to ensure we avoid waste. In this initiative, we work with the aluminium producers across the globe, but ideally with enabling institutions, be it policymakers, be it demand sectors such as yourselves, but also financial institutions. Next slide, please. This is just very briefly an overview of what our workstream looked like today. And I'll briefly go through the deliverables that we had over the year, but most importantly, to look ahead, particularly the work that we are going to jointly deliver with the IAI. First of all, what is really important to engage the industry. I saw a question in the Q&A, is the community or is the industry coalescing towards a 1.5 degree scenario? That is really what we're driving towards. And what we've seen over last year is really an uptick in climate ambition, but we are not there yet. So really the Mission Possible Partnership is to build confidence that these pathways are technologically feasible and to build understanding which enabling factors will help accelerate this transition. For this year, it's a very, very wide list of steps that need to be taken. It is really not going to be an easy undertaking for the sector. But for this year, we focused on two fundamental pillars. One is the role of the electricity decarbonization, which is a large chunk of the emissions across the sector. But here we actually focused on a China deep dive. Why do we focus on China? For fundamentally scale reasons. China is the largest producer, consumer, and emitter in the aluminium sector, and is a fundamental player to ensure that the sector as a whole will meet the 1.5 degree pathway. But it is also the sector where a lot has grown over the last 20 years. So a lot of the new smelters, the new facilities were built in China. So they really have a big leap to take in order to decarbonize. So it's a fundamental region to pay particular attention to. The second element we're looking at this year is really the direct emissions, so the process emissions, and what role could technologies play in that? Pernell already touched on several. One that is really well known is the anode technology that is very aluminium specific. But what we've learned over this last year is that there are multiple technologies across different industries that could be potentially applicable to the sector as well. So what we wanted to understand over the last year is, what does that landscape look like? What are the different technologies? At what stage are they now? Does that differ between different industries towards the aluminium sector? And what opportunities for collaborations exist? But we don't work in isolation. So what you see at the bottom of the slide are different initiatives that are happening that are relevant for all heavy industries. What is the role of finance? How can we ensure investment needs are going to be met in order to really accelerate in the coming decades? The First Movers Coalition, I will get back to that in a few slides. But also, Pernell touched upon it as well, how can we actually trace this? How do we actually account for emissions? And how can these be standardized? Next slide, please. So I'll talk you briefly through, and I assume you have the slides, so you will have links to every deliverable that we had over the last year, and don't hesitate to reach out. But we really started with building a narrative, which is fundamentally in line with the IEI, 3 key pillars to decarbonize the aluminium sector. This was launched last year to really build a common narrative for the sector and rally them around this shared narrative. Next slide. As mentioned, we're developing a China deep dive. We literally just had last week our first kickoff meeting in English, but also in Mandarin, to make sure that the Chinese community is part of this conversation, with the ambition for 2022 to further develop China work that is specific for China, but where we actually bring in the wider global aluminium community as well. Next slide, please. What we launched literally last week is our landscape report. Which technologies are the most promising to support the decarbonization of direct emissions within the aluminium production? This is a report we very much closely developed with the industry themselves. So that is really fundamental to both IEI's work and our work, is that whatever we develop is in close collaboration with the industry to ensure it's realistic, but to also really engage the industry on the needs and the conversation towards net zero. Next slide, please. What I wanted to take a moment is actually to look ahead. There are 2 fundamental work streams that we are working towards for 2022. And one is really to delve into the 1.5 degree pathway Pernell just explained, and really go into depth. What does this mean for different end sectors? What does this mean for different regions? And how can we understand the pathway towards 1.5 degree scenario and different incremental milestones per every 5 years to understand what is actually needed to turn this into reality? And the example that is here is the one that we launched for steel in October earlier this year. And for us, it's really important that this pathways and this sector transition strategy is carried and supported by the industry. It's fundamental to our work to have that buy-in. We will launch this work in January with the IAI and hope to have this ready by May or June later this year, next year, I should say. Next slide, please. I wanted to also bring this to the attention of this audience, knowing that these are key demand users of aluminium. This is organized by the World Economic Forum in collaboration with the US State Department, and it's called the First Movers Coalition. And it's really focused on building collective purchasing power for companies to ensure there is a clear signal for needs for low carbon materials. This was launched at COP26 with a few sectors to start, which included steel, mobility, shipping, aviation, and trucking. And we are working towards other materials in 2022 in collaboration with the US State Department to have similar collective purchasing signs or signals, I should say, for the different sectors to really set an example that the market demand is there, but to also build confidence to support the investment decisions that need to be made, preferably as soon as possible, in order to meet 2030 milestone. Next slide, please. This is just briefly to visualize. So we launched 4 phase 1 sectors. Phase 2 sectors will be launched at Davos and after Davos, which will be the end of January. So hopefully more news to come, particularly to key demand users of aluminium towards the First Movers Coalition commitment statement for the aluminium sector in 2022. And with that, Jen, I am opening the floor for questions. And a big thank you for hosting us.
Great, thank you so much, Renee and Pernell. Those are fantastic presentations and so much content in there, as well as in the reports that you mentioned. So I hope everyone dives into those if they haven't already. We do have a couple of questions already in the Q&A chat, but again, just remind everybody to use that. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and we can take you off mute and take questions that way too. So I think, Renee, you touched on the first question a little bit already, but Pernell, if you have any additional context or insight you'd like to share, the question is around whether the industry is coalescing around a 1.5 or a 2 degree Celsius emission.
Yeah, sure. I can add some comments on that. So I guess maybe to start with is a little bit about kind of the motivations for us in terms of providing both the beyond 2 degree and then the 1.5 degree scenario. So we wanted to provide this kind of sector level information for companies then to sort of take away and then understand how it would fit for themselves. So, you know, sector information is really useful, but in reality, companies kind of have to come up with their own plans to get to some of these pretty significant endpoints in 2050. And so I think what we're seeing more and more is definitely an interest in understanding what does this mean for me as a company in terms of, you know, how it's going through the industry. And now that we're actually able to quantify what it means when we say, oh, you're 1.5 degree aligned or you're beyond 2 degree aligned, people get a better feel for what that actually means. So, you know, just by having, for example, those intensity numbers, most companies know what their intensity is. They know that, you know, what the emissions are associated with their production process, and so they can see where they are today and where they need to be in 2050. So I wouldn't say that there's a particular kind of move towards one or the other, but what we are definitely seeing is an increased appetite for people to kind of translate those sector trajectories into what it means for us as a company and what we have to then implement over the next 10 years in order to be aligned at least with those goals. So, you know, I think it certainly started an interesting conversation throughout the industry, and people are using it almost as a reference point for kind of checking up. Are we at the right point? How far away are we, and how much do we have to decrease our emissions by? Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then another question for somebody who had to drop off, but for reference for everyone, we are recording this, so we'll be posting it online later, and then of course sharing the slides with everyone afterwards. So the question is, are you able to support with customer demand signaling? Some model wording that provides consistency that can be used in procurement would be very helpful in that regard. Renee, this might be something that's coming down the road, I'm guessing.
I was going to say, I think this is probably Renee's ideal platform.
No, it's a phenomenal question, because the reason I highlighted those 2 work streams for 2022 is these are interlinked. These don't happen in isolation. So the reason we are building a sector transition strategy is multifold, but one of them is to support a scientific base for helping define a collective purchasing signal based on specific commitments. So what is realistic to say, hypothetically, by 2030, company X will commit to buy 10 or 20% of its aluminum input for a level that is 0.x of carbon emissions emitted per ton produced. This is exactly how these two works are connected. So to ensure that we have the data points and the knowledge of the IAI that feeds directly into a development of a purchasing signal. So very good question.
Yeah, I'm very, very much looking forward to that. So we have a little more time. Oh, one more question. As a buyer, how can we get involved?
By reaching out to me. Yes, so it's an initiative that will kick off in 2022. And absolutely, anyone who is interested to learn a bit more about it, there's a lot more information about this initiative. I am more than happy to speak to. So don't hesitate, Jen, to introduce to anyone who's interested to know more.
Great. And I believe we will be sharing both of your contact information, assuming I don't hear anything to the contrary, afterwards. So we will be sharing those emails out afterwards. Great. We have a little more time if there are any more questions. Audience, and again, you're welcome to raise your hand and come off mute if you'd like to. Well, seeing no more, hearing no more, I think that might wrap it up for us today. I want to thank again RENEE and Pernell so much for joining us. It's fantastic content and something that I think a number of companies have been wanting to learn more about. So I really appreciate your time today. And we will be following up afterwards with everyone with the presentation and contact information. Oh, one more question coming in. What cross-sector collaboration opportunities are you excited about?
You want to go for now first, and I'll go.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first and just kind of, well, I guess firstly, I'm actually quite excited to take part in the sector transition strategy that RENEE mentioned. And I know that in itself isn't necessarily a cross-sector collaboration, just by us working closer with NPP, who have done so much across other sectors. It means that we are then able to kind of learn about what's happened in other sectors. And also, you know, just on the technology front, so many of these technologies are being relied upon across lots of different sectors. You know, you hear about green hydrogen, you hear about CCUS, you hear about increased renewables across pretty much all sectors today. And so I think there are so many opportunities for us to actually work together to scale up some of those things. I know that RENEE's looking into things like industrial clusters, things like that is so exciting, where you have heavy industry co-located, and you can really take advantage of that to bring some of these big logistical challenges together. So we're looking forward to doing more and more of that, and part of the reason we're actually working so closely with RENEE and NPP is because it does open up so many of those cross-sector opportunities. So that for me is kind of where I'm looking forward to working on more.
Yeah, so Pernell mentioned it. What I'm really excited about is actually the concept of industrial clusters, but net zero industrial clusters. Industrial clusters as such are nothing new. They've been around for a long, long time. But what we're seeing is that really the role of scale and shared infrastructure really matters in decarbonization pathways for heavy industries. And as an example, and we don't really fully grasp it yet, is the role of CCUS. The role of CCUS is acknowledged as potentially playing a substantial role for the aluminium sector, but it's not without its challenges, because the level of gas of CO2 concentration in what is emitted by the aluminium production is relatively low, which makes it very expensive to apply CCUS, and at this stage it is too costly. So how can you potentially leverage collaboration of several sectors that actually can share the infrastructure to reduce costs, but to also accelerate, hence, the deployment of these technologies. So I think we are really at the cusp of a very interesting decade, but these collaborations are highly, highly complex. And that will be really the key challenge, is how to manage that. But yes, very exciting times ahead, I think.
Great. We have a couple more questions coming in, so I'm glad to see that. So one was actually in the chat. Says, I'm a packaging manufacturer. What advice do you have around addressing sustainability information gaps? We use regional efficiency factors from a database to estimate our CO2 emissions, but a specific PCF from our suppliers would support data gaps and inform our own decarbonization roadmap. Is there a plan industry-wide to promote PCF generation, and is pushing our suppliers to provide PCF the right approach?
Maybe jump in on that and provide some views. So I think we're seeing it more and more, that people want to really understand exactly what they're buying. And so, you know, I understand some of the challenges that are out there in terms of kind of sustainability data gaps. We have to make various assumptions or use regional or even sometimes global factors where we don't have specific data. But what I would say is, I think we're seeing more and more some of that kind of producer-consumer relationship building, and I think it is going to become increasingly important. So I do think it probably is the right approach to ask your suppliers for detailed data. They may not have everything, but the more and more detailed data you can get, the more accurate the picture you're able to build, and the more confidence you'll have in what you're actually purchasing. So I do think we're going to see more and more of that, and I think that probably is the way to go.
And yeah, I would just say from a kind of broader decarbonization perspective for these kind of industrial commodities, just asking for that information can be a really important demand signal in and of itself. So another question, will these efforts also work to cascade reduction upstream from aluminum producers, material extraction, and scrap supply chains?
I can take that one. Yes, that is the intention. So in the end, we're looking at a value chain of emissions, and we are currently still scoping the sector transition strategy work, but engagement from extraction to actually the end demand is the scope that we're looking at. So the ambition is definitely there to ensure that there is an entire value chain perspective, and then that knowledge should at least trigger deeper engagement with the upstream sectors as well.
Great, thank you both. We do have a few more minutes left if there's any lingering questions, or Renee or Pernille, if there's kind of any final comments or thoughts you would like to leave the group with.
Nothing for me, just a thank you, really. You know, it's great to be able to kind of explain some of this information, explain some of the work that we've been doing to a broader audience. And, you know, just from the questions, I can see that you've got a really engaged group of people on the line. So it's been a real pleasure from my side.
I can only echo, and the key thing is to reach out, because in the end, what we are all developing is to ensure you can meet your own targets as well. It is a shared endeavor. So whatever major questions or key themes you feel are blind spots, we are also here to learn. So we hopefully gave you some information regarding the aluminium sector, and it's a great privilege to be given that opportunity. But definitely me, I'm also here to learn. So don't hesitate to reach out to learn more, but also share your perspectives and views on what is needed to support your own trajectory towards net zero.
Great. Well, with that, thank you again both so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone who attended to listen. Really appreciate your time and your questions. And again, we'll be following up with the slides and contact information if you'd like to continue the conversation.